Today's presentation is a sneak preview of Dr. Davis's essay, Black Agriculture, White Anger, Arguments over Aboriginal Land Use in Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, or to be published in the Borderlands inaugural print edition in July this year.
So Dark Emu was published by Bruce Pascoe in 2014, and he reprinted it. As you can see up on the screen there is a slide saying what Dark Emu is about. Pascoe uses early European eyewitness accounts to reconstruct Aboriginal land use prior to and just after British colonisation around the late 17th and early to mid 18th century and 19th century. He argues that at the time these European eyewitness accounts were being recorded, that in his conclusion, most Aboriginals were at the very least in the early stages of an agricultural society. So Pascoe builds on early scholarly work undertaken by Rupert Gerritsen and Bill Gamage, where they both describe Aboriginal practices of agriculture and aquaculture undertaken in Australia prior to the arrival of Europeans. So, as you can see in this slide, there are two main arguments against the book. Pascoe exaggerates or embellishes historical sources and selectively quotes from them, and that he is not really Aboriginal. And you probably are aware that in January 2020, a request was made by the Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton to check on whether Pascoe is financially benefiting from claiming to be Aboriginal or not, and that the Federal Police put that aside and said there was no case to answer there, but the criticisms of his work have not abated. So on the left, support for opportunity to reread the history of Australia as one of Aboriginal technical sophistication has seen an embrace of the direction of Pascoe's arguments. Not a great deal of engagement with his use of historical sources, but support for a re-questioning of or rereading of the history of Australia prior to Aboriginal Australia's prior to colonisation. And on the right, the criticisms have coalesced around questioning Pascoe's factual accuracy and deriding his interpretations that Aboriginal people practice any form of agriculture. In this paper, I'm really focusing on what I call the right's response to Bruce Pascoe's work and why it's taken the shape it has and what its implications are. So I'm not really going into Pascoe's own arguments per se, but the sort of meta-narrative around what's at stake in the arguments that Pascoe, Gerritsen, Gamage and other scholars are making about Australian Aboriginal peoples in relation to aquaculture, agriculture and habitation buildings. The most publicly accessible criticisms from the right are found on the website Dark Emu Exposed. You can go and look it up yourself, and that really culminates in Peter O'Brien's book Bitter Harvest, The Illusion of Aboriginal Agriculture. Thanks for bearing with me. Now, criticism of Pascoe on the left and the right revolves a lot around his use of historical sources, and he's often inaccurate in the way he uses those sources. So he embellishes them at times, he selectively quotes at other times, and this raises the question of how much trust can be put in the arguments that Pascoe makes about Aboriginal land use. And it's this weakness of Pascoe that the right has taken aim at and raised a further issue about how facts are used to advance a particular argument or agenda. Now, this discussion about facts, truth and trust has relevance when considering attacks from the right on Pascoe's work, because it's, in my opinion, it's the broader idea of facts as reinforced by researchers, research communities of recognition, healthy public life and institutional support that is under attack. Just to give an example of how this is played out on the website Dark Emu Exposed, If you go to that website, you'll see many examples of criticisms in the following vein. In 1974, the anthropologist Norman Tyndale creates a map of traditional brain areas that stretch across the continent. In 2015, a Commonwealth agency, the Rural Industries Research and Development Corporation, reproduced this map on the potential for the commercial exploitation for native grasses. In my background research for this, I have witnessed a video where Bruce Pascoe gives a public talk, and he says he comes across this 2015 discussion paper. So clearly he's alerted to Tyndale's map through that, and he uses that as an important part of his claim that across the continent, from east to west largely, from the middle of Western Australia across the South Australia and Northern Territory into parts of Queensland and northern New South Wales, there are grain gathering and harvesting and areas that Aboriginal peoples are using prior to colonisation. Now, Pascoe expands Tyndale's area and poorly explains why he does so. Their justification is there in his work, Pascoe's book, but it's actually quite hard to make sense of. So he expands it, he gives some references, but he doesn't really make clear what the relationship between the references and the expanded area is. And Dark Emu Exposed says that Pascoe basically makes up the expanded area in order to make an argument that Aboriginal people were involved in large-scale farming and gathering of grains across Australia. Pascoe's at fault here. He's careless in explaining the expansion, but Dark Emu Exposed are also lazy in not checking his sources. They could do so. I went and did it, and you can see what Pascoe's doing. He's more of a storyteller than a scholar, so he's not doing that kind of firm scholarly practice of explaining his sources and the way he comes to interpretations and conclusions. Not only that, many critics are prepared to put their name to the evaluation of Dark Emu. However, Dark Emu Exposed criticisms of Pascoe are entirely anonymously authored. And this is explained as academic and government employee contributors seeking protection from criticism of other progressive academics. And it literally says that in the published version of this paper that will come out in Borderlands in July, you'll get the reference for that so you can follow that through yourself. I'm just marking off where I'm at in my PowerPoint presentations. And what the editor of Dark Emu Exposed, Roger Karge, says is that that it is seeking to set up values of intellectual honesty and academic freedom, but it doesn't put names to those people who authored the document, the articles on Dark Emu Exposed. So it's a kind of strange abrogation of academic freedom and intellectual honesty.